much for joining us on this Friday morning. I'm Michelle Nellenbach, the Director of Strategic Initiatives here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. So excited to bring you this event today. We have got an amazing panel, several panels of speakers. But first I want to set the stage a little bit. So BPC has an infrastructure project that for years has been advocating that we need to incorporate more resilience into federal infrastructure programs so that we are building stronger to both reduce the loss of property and life and bring down the cost of natural disaster response. As part of that effort, once COVID hit and we had a new pressure on a lot of those agencies and staff who handle these natural disasters, we convened a task force of former state and federal officials who've overseen disaster recovery and have had to both secure and oversee federal funding. Our goal is to harness their collective expertise to inform the discussion around federal disaster programs. And so, as you know, many of these programs are being tested as never before with COVID. As we saw with the recent Hurricane Isaias, there's been a lot of tension about how do you safely evacuate? How do you safely shelter in place during a hurricane and still maintain social distance to prevent further COVID spread? So these are challenges that emergency managers are facing day in and day out, especially now with hurricane season increasing. We've had 9 named storms since June, and by all indications, there's going to be a lot more. And so we're going to be joined today by a number of folks who can talk through how states are balancing these two distinct crises. But first, we're going to be joined, and I'm so thrilled, by Representative Stacey Plaskett, a Democrat from the Virgin Islands. She helped steer the island's recovery from Hurricane Maria and Irma in 2017. Representative Plaskett currently serves on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, where she pushes for improvements to critical infrastructure in the Virgin Islands and other insular areas, as well as the development of economically depressed rural and urban areas. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us. We're anxious to hear your comments on how the islands are handling the recovery from the hurricanes years ago and also the COVID crisis. So I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. And I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for organizing this forum. I also, of course, want to thank the panelists for joining. I think this is an excellent opportunity to for all of us to speak about the current issues in hurricane and disaster preparedness and responses while we are in the midst of a viral pandemic. As we all know, some natural disasters like hurricanes often result in evacuations and displacement of survivors. Today, we examine how preparations for responding to these disasters can continue while overlapping with the nation's ongoing efforts to combat the coronavirus. FEMA is the lead federal agency for coordinating preparation, prevention, mitigation, and response and recovery from our disasters, including the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. But in recent years, FEMA has struggled to manage the severity of multiple disasters due in part to climate change. In this unprecedented moment, as our country continues to respond to the virus and a recent surge in cases across numerous high-impact areas, we really find ourselves in uncharted territory. More than 160,000 Americans have lost their lives. At the same time, we see climate change increasing the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, setting the stage for possible loss of even more American lives as a result of natural disasters in the coming months. Just this year, this hurricane season, which began on June 1st, and NOAA expects 13 to 19 named storms, including 6 to 10 hurricanes and 3 to 6 major hurricanes. Therefore, it's imperative that the American public understand the steps being taken to prepare for and respond to natural disasters, including hurricanes, on top of the efforts to stop the spread of the coronavirus. The pandemic will further complicate FEMA's challenges in responding to extreme weather events that we know are increasing in frequency and severity as a result of climate change. One example is the management of mass evacuations and sheltering. Residents in states and territories known to be hardest hit by hurricanes are also, interestingly, facing some of the highest rates of COVID-19 cases. This year's predicted higher than average hurricane season increases the chance of large evacuations of people, including north to areas previously hard hit by the virus, bringing with it the potential of an increased spread in those areas. In addition, according to FEMA, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments share responsibility for coordinating emergency sheltering support after a disaster. For those who are lower income and forced to stay and seek emergency shelters, as they do not have the means to evacuate overcrowded shelters from schools to convention centers, risks are becoming infection hotspots. The current lags in COVID-19 testing, if not fixed, could lead to asymptomatic people who carry virus staying in shelters, and many of those same people who have less access to health care, less health insurance, who are more likely to have unknown or uncontrollable comorbidities, may be put at higher risk of complications from COVID-19. This is a prime example of how climate change can act as a threat multiplier during public health crises. Emergency sheltering assistance is typically authorized under the Stafford Act, following either an emergency or a major disaster declaration, and commonly falls under Public Assistance Category B, Emergency Protective Measures. FEMA will reimburse states, tribal, territorial, and local governments, as well as eligible nonprofits, for at least 75% of eligible costs incurred while performing eligible work. For example, FEMA may reimburse congregate sheltering costs, including facility leasing and utilities, supplies like food and furnishing, staffing, and other services such as cleaning and medical care. FEMA typically supports congregate sheltering in facilities with large open spaces, such as community centers and schools. The COVID-19 pandemic, however, has complicated efforts to provide sheltering in typical congregate settings. FEMA has acknowledged the need to ensure appropriate social distancing. Therefore, on June 17th, FEMA issued an interim policy to authorize non-congregate sheltering, such as sheltering that affords privacy, as an eligible emergency protective measure when needed in the event of Stafford Act declared incidents between June 1st and December 31st of 2020. FEMA also recommends sheltering with friends or family and other temporary housing solutions. For example, the Transitional Sheltering Assistance Program provides temporary hotel and motel accommodations for eligible disaster survivors transitioning from congregate or non-congregate shelters to temporary or permanent housing solutions. In addition, blue roofing is a form of direct federal assistance to homeowners with fiber reinforced sheltering to cover damaged roofs, allowing disaster survivors to remain in their homes while permanent repairs are completed. This program could reduce the need for emergency shelters if hurricanes or other hazards were to damage homes during the pandemic. But there remains significant concerns about the level of detailed guidance to state, territorial, and local governments regarding the handling of natural disasters in the coming months and who pays. Managing sheltering and evacuations can be logistically challenging, and state and local officials already preoccupied with response efforts related to the pandemic and previous disasters are now also responsible for rethinking their planning and response for future disasters, including sheltering and evacuation operations. Moreover, every state and territory faces a budget shortfall. Many will be more dependent on FEMA for supplies and other needs during that time. Thus, potential considerations to support emergency sheltering during the pandemic include reducing or eliminating public assistance, non-federal cost share, generally 25% given state and territorial budget shortfalls, reducing demand for emergency sheltering that is often limited availability, such as by extending the CARES Act moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, or temporarily extending housing assistance for individuals who lack housing during the pandemic, and examining options to increase COVID-19 testing in shelters, given that FEMA's guidance documents do not detail plans to provide or expedite testing sheltered populations. I hope we can discuss some of these considerations today. We need answers about what steps are being taken to protect the lives of survivors and response personnel. We need to better understand how plans can be adapted to account for simultaneous disasters. We need to know more about the capacity and whether medical supplies and other essentials will be available to communities. We need to help emergency managers so that they can prepare to fulfill their mission. We need to be prepared and able to address the worst case scenarios. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you all today. And thanks so much, and everyone, please be safe.
Thank you for those great remarks, Congresswoman. You laid out very, very well the challenges that the states and territories who are at risk of hurricanes this season are facing between balancing those needs with that of COVID. And so thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Appreciate the comments. And
Thanks
with that,
for
I'm
having
going to
me.
turn Oh, sure. Thank you. Be safe. We're going to turn everybody over now to our colleague Brian Kuhn, who is with, he is the Vice President of Homeland Security and Emergency Management for IEM, but previously he was the Director of Emergency Management for the state of Florida. Very well, very familiar with how to handle hurricanes. And so Brian is going to take us through the next couple of panels. So take it away, Brian.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Representative Plaskett, for the overview. I'm very excited to be here today and to share a conversation with some of our nation's premier emergency managers, folks who have been in this fight, and we'll be able to talk to you all directly about, the challenges that we are facing as a nation, as individual states that they represent, what we have done thus far, what remains to be done this hurricane season, and then what is the long-term implications of this? What can we learn from this event? What should we consider restructuring? How do we fund this? How do we staff these? And so, those are some of the outcomes that we're looking for today. Very excited to have our first panelist with us this morning is Brock Long. Brock, many of you all have worked with in the past or know he was a former FEMA administrator for the Trump administration. He has also served in other capacities. He was on the hurricane liaison team. He was the director of emergency management for the state of Alabama. He's currently the executive chairman of Haggerty Consulting. Been in this industry a long time, has lots of ideas, lots of exciting things. We invite you all to submit questions throughout this, and then we'll start. I will pose those to Brock towards the end of our conversation. There are multiple ways you can pose questions. You can either do it through YouTube or Facebook. You can tweet them using the hashtag BPC Live, and I will see all of those on the screen and pose them to Brock. I will go ahead and answer your first questions. All of you I know are thinking right now, which is, what would Brock Long look like in 5 years if he really just let himself go? And this is what it would look like. So Brock, Thank you for being with us this morning. Very excited to have you. I'm going to start off, based on building upon what Representative Plaskett talked about. We're at the middle of August right now. We all know that the first couple of months of hurricane season are really just warm up. So what do the next few months look like? What are our biggest challenges right now that we should be focused on?
Brian, first of all, it's always good to see you. I think the last time I saw you physically face to face was Hurricane Irma, what I affectionately refer to as the forgotten Cat 4, but it's good to see you again. Obviously right now, the disaster of mass evacuation is something that we have got to address in the future. We cannot continue to do evacuations the way that we've done them for the last couple of decades. And I often joke that we perfected this man-made disaster because we often asked people to evacuate hundreds of miles And the reason for that is because we have never put in proper building codes. We have never put in proper residential codes. The shelter capacity doesn't expand with populations in those vulnerable areas either. And there are no real programs to fund shelter capability and dual use buildings for communities to be able to handle this type of mission. But right now, a lot of emergency managers are faced with a tough decision. One, you have to evacuate people for the hurricane. That's the 50-meter target, obviously. If you can't save lives because of the hurricane, then COVID doesn't really matter in the secondary event. COVID is the 100-meter target. And once you get to people to safe locations, you're going to have to ask them to be able to continue doing what they've been asked to do for the last couple of months, which is stop the spread and putting in social distancing techniques. But what emergency managers are going to be faced with is reduced shelter capacity because of the need, the capability of being able to separate people properly. So there's going to be a higher shelter demand, upon the current shelter stock, which has been drastically reduced because of the needs of, protecting people from COVID. And then the other big problem is because of the financial impact to American households. Typically what we see is that poverty rate or a lack of financial resiliency really drives the evacuation shelter demand that we've seen in the past. So, for example, if you look at the hurricane evacuation studies that FEMA's done, Brian, if you ask 100,000 people to evacuate, 5 to 8% of those evacuating are typically looking for shelters. Well, I believe that number is going to grow, unfortunately, because of where we are with the unemployment rates as a result of of COVID, which is something else that these guys are going to have to tackle. But going forward, I believe that we have got to, as a nation, take COVID-19, the disasters of 17 and 18 that I had to go through, as a catalyst for making real improvements. There is not a single bullet that's going to change the way that we do business, but over time, we have got to really focus and streamline how we do resilience and reduce the need for mass evacuations.
Yeah, you mentioned the 5 to 8% number. That's exactly in line with what we saw. You mentioned during Hurricane Irma. During Hurricane Irma in Florida, we issued the evacuation order for about 7 million Floridians, and 350,000 of them went to the shelters. And this is a conversation I'll have with Director Moskowitz in a little bit, which is now that, what do you do in a similar situation this year? How are we going to handle all of those folks? Let's dive a little bit more deeply into individual preparedness. That's been an area of focus and importance for you over the years, helping families think about their own financial well-being and being prepared for those rainy days so that they can take care of themselves. And one of the things that we've got to be able to do as a nation is to allow and empower these folks to have that safety net there. What are some of the things we can do right now, perhaps, to help that? And what can we do longer term, do you think, in terms of giving them the tools to get there?
Well, starting with the longer term, FEMA's business model is being broken because of a lack of financial resiliency and a lack of insurance. And, part of FEMA's strategic plan is closing the gap of the lack of insurance. And I know this is tough to talk about and it's not easy to digest. And, it's a very complex problem, but you've got climate change on one hand, which is increasing the frequency and the magnitude of the disasters. But on the social side, too many Americans can't put their hands on $500 cash. So our traditional preparedness campaigns of saying, go get a kit for 3 to 5 days is an unrealistic financial ask in most American households right now. And so in the future, I think that Congress needs to look at the types of education and the access to financial resiliency education in all communities across all walks of life. And it's not just income poverty, it's asset poverty, or the inability to save 3 to 6 months worth of operational savings and account for rainy day funds. Well, then that further, impacts the lack of insurance when they experience disasters upon their household. And what we saw in 17 and 18 was a dramatic increase in the number of people applying for individual assistance because of this problem. And, FEMA is not going to be able to keep up. FEMA cannot make people whole. And so there's got to be more of a whole community approach of how we're addressing the future aspects of disaster recovery. What I think the immediate impacts are going to be is that, people are going to need more. They're going to be more transportation dependent. For example, they're not going to have the finances to buy multiple tanks of gas and go stay in a hotel. So I think that you're going to see government having to, at all levels, not just FEMA, but at all levels, being able to increase their support services for transportation dependent communities, being able to help out on the individual assistance side. And it may force FEMA to do more of a pre-disaster declaration to turn on and turning on individual assistance to help people evacuating, which would be somewhat unprecedented.
Now, Brock, one of the things that you and I share as a passion for mitigation, we are both on the board of directors for the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes. One of the opportunities that it usually presents themselves after large-scale disasters is to be able to reform our federal laws to improve the way we do disaster recovery and preparedness. And we've seen it after Hurricanes Andrew and Pekemra and Katrina and 9/11. We saw it a couple of years ago with the DRRA. There's a real likelihood that we'll see something after COVID. If you could put in a couple of things into that legislation, what are the kinds of things that you would like to see us improve as a nation?
Well, first of all, the passage of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, I congratulate Congress on listening to me about the need for pre-disaster mitigation funding, but it's not quite where it needs to be. I think we need to go back and take a look at the Stafford Act, which was first put in place in 1979. It was a very innovative act back in the day, but it doesn't, unfortunately, it doesn't recognize communities that put in real mitigation strategies that could reduce the impact upon loss of life or destruction to property. And the Stafford Act needs to be revised to be able to incentivize state and local communities with implementing residential codes, building codes, proper land use planning, because we've kind of invented this disaster of mass evacuation over the last couple of years. We allow people to populate coastal areas. It's not like hurricanes are new. We've had devastating hurricanes, going way back in history. And the bottom line is that we're going to have to fix this problem through proper codes so that you can ultimately reduce the number of people that you ask to evacuate and the distance that they have to travel to seek safe distance. If we keep doing the evacuation process the way we currently do it as a nation, it is not sustainable in the future. So if you take coastal communities like Miami-Dade, their evacuation clearance time, based on the way we currently do evacuation business, would grow tremendously, and they would have to issue evacuations 10 days out, possibly 2 weeks out, 2 weeks out, which would devastate small businesses. And they're having to do this because we haven't put in the right codes. And yes, there are people who argue that, enforcing building codes would be too expensive on the construction side. But I would argue with them that they need to go take a look at Mexico Beach. They need to go look at Paradise, California, and some of these other communities that have been devastated. And I promise you that the recovery process is way more expensive than spending money up front to ensure a proper code based on the hazards associated with a geographic area.
I concur, and I think one of the challenges we'll have is that as we start this recovery from COVID, we're going to see the housing market. We'll see issues in the housing market as a result of unemployment and other issues, and so we're simultaneously going to want to try to improve codes, as you discussed, while we're having issues with the housing market. And so we'll see that conversation occur, which is how can we help simultaneously raise the housing market and improve the housing stock. We've talked a little bit about funding, and we've seen Congress act with the CARES Act, and a lot of those monies have been provided to the state, local, territorial, tribal governments. Have you seen innovative ways that they're utilizing those funds? Have you seen them use the funds to help combat the potential issues we've talked about with hurricane season thus far? And what remains to be done in terms of both utilizing the current funding and potential funding that they're still considering in your estimation?
Well, Brian, Congress has a lot of work to do in conjunction with FEMA and the other agencies that provide recovery funding because it's become way too complex. So if I remember correctly, when I was in office from 17 and 18, if you look at all the funding that's going to go out from FEMA because of the 2 years I was in office, to fix communities, it's more than the 9 previous FEMA administrators combined. All right, that had nothing to do with FEMA. And that money went to 20 different federal government agencies to fund over 90 different recovery programs. Now you've got Congress appropriating money, rightfully so, for COVID-19. But the money is massive and it's in multiple pots. And so if you're the mayor of a community that's facing hurricanes, but also the COVID issue, you're like a deer in headlights because you're not sure what you're entitled to, how to sequence this funding, how to make sure that you avoid duplication of this funding. And then what are the systems that are telling a mayor, hey, if you use the money in this manner, you will ultimately become more resilient. And I think as we go forward as a result of COVID and all this money that's out there is that Congress has got to figure out a way to streamline this funding and open it up to the specific uses for recovery to each community rather than putting down arbitrary timelines or, risk adverse strings to where they really can't use it. My fear of the COVID funding is that a lot of the money sunsets December 31st. It's an arbitrary deadline that needs to be lifted because we don't even know remotely what the economic problems are going to be next year or 2 years as a result of this. So the money is great and the communities need it, but they need time to reflect and understand how best to use it. And they need a lot of discretion with that funding to use it in a manner that's most meaningful to their community. And that's the problem with disaster cost recovery is nobody knows how to fully do it. It's way too complex and we've got to reduce the complexity. And that was goal number 3 of FEMA. But it's, they've got a lot of work to do and there needs to be another committee that specifically looks at that, in my opinion.
Understood. And I know that you got a lot of pressure as FEMA administrator to answer the question, we give all this money to the states post-disaster. Why is it taking them so long to spend that money? What are they doing with it? Do they really need it? If they're not spending it in a timely manner, is it actually necessary? And, I think you and I both agree that it is, but you and I both understand the challenge associated with getting that money out there and do it in a way that accomplishes what you want to do and meets all of the federal requirements. So I absolutely concur with you on that.
Brian, the purpose of the BPC is to look at infrastructure resilience too. And I think that, one of the things that we started at FEMA was community lifelines. And it got to the point where I started asking the question and FEMA started asking the question of, if something breaks in a community and people die or life routine is severely disrupted, what is it? Let's identify it and let's call it a community lifeline. And we came up with 7 initial community lifelines, right? So safety and security, you have to have safety and security in place, all the aspects of safety and security from logistics to support it. If you don't have safety and security, you can't have a functioning community. If you look at COVID-19, it was a breakdown in the health and medical supply chains, critical supply chains. We saw a breakdown in power grids, fuel in hurricanes and different things. But a lot of the infrastructure that we've identified is not owned by FEMA or the federal government. There's some suggestions that 85% of the infrastructure that we depend on as citizens is owned by the private sector, but yet everybody expects FEMA to fix it and get it back online when they have no control over it. So when it goes forward and thinking about resilience in this money, whether it's the CARES Act or future resilience dollars, we've got to find a way to work meaningfully with the private sector that runs the infrastructure that we depend on to help them bolster that, to reduce, because I'm not a believer that bigger FEMA is the answer. We tried that in 1992 after Andrew. We did it again in 2005 with PCMRA, and that turned FEMA into 911, which is something that the agency hasn't been able to recover from. And what I don't want to happen is that we need a bigger FEMA as a result of COVID-19. That's not the answer. It's all of us working together from proper and responsible cultures of preparedness at the citizen level all the way to the federal government.
Good. Thank you, Brock. So I'm starting to get in questions from the audience, and Mark Pappas has a question similar to what I had on my list as well. So I'm just going to combine the two. And since we started talking about infrastructure just then, the DRRA funded the Building Resilient and Infrastructure in Communities, the BRIC program, which will be funded at a rate of 6% of what the previous year's disasters were. I don't think that we anticipated that we were going to be spending as much money out of the DRF as we're going to this year, but that's a great news for the BRIC program, great news for mitigation. So I'm combining Mark Pappas's question, which is, do you see the BRIC as a moving as a step in the right direction for mitigation? And I'm asking you, what kind of projects would you like to see? We've got the opportunity with BRIC to do some really ambitious, large-scale projects that perhaps we weren't able to through previous mitigation programs. What are some of the ones you'd like to see come through next year when that program opens up for applications?
Well, I appreciate Mark's question. I hope everybody in Rhode Island's doing well, Mark Pappas. You know, the thing about the funding is BRIC is just the start. My first concern is I don't believe the first allotment, $500 million, is the true 6% of what FEMA put out in the public assistance arena. And I think that somebody needs to go back in and look at what the true 6% was, because that number seems very low to me based on the amount of money going out of FEMA's doors. Okay. Two, it's not just FEMA. So state legislatures have to step up and start funding mitigation in a meaningful manner in conjunction with the BRIC program, same at the local level. So this is not just, we can't just depend a program upon FEMA and put it on their shoulders solely. But the money is directly, you know, tied back to the community lifelines of, if these lifelines break and people die and life routine is disrupted, then we have to have a structure to do mitigation to make sure that those lifelines never fail, that communication systems don't go down, health and medical systems don't go down. And, you know, if you look at, again, COVID, it's a breakdown in the health and medical lifeline. It's a breakdown in large-scale logistical supply chains. Local hospitals weren't storing equipment. They had one contract to a vendor that was providing them PPE and just-in-time logistics. They didn't have backup contracts. The major suppliers to these hospitals were highly leveraged on contracts in China, Malaysia. Well, we've got to go back and bolster those supply chains. So it's not just physical infrastructure, it's the supply chains, and it's also going back and rethinking how we ask people to prepare. So if asset poverty says people can't put their hands on $500, then we got to stop asking them to be prepared for 3 to 5 days, because it's an unrealistic financial ask. And we've got to go back and give them tangible skills and education skills. You know, and I've always said this, we put too much focus on the stupid SAT score for our kids, but we teach them nothing about a credit score. And so we've got to correct that. You know, when you look at mitigation, it's got to be a holistic approach. It's got to be more than FEMA's BRIC program. That's just one of the elements.
Yeah, and some background for everybody. Brock and I chatted yesterday, and Brock mentioned that same thing he just said. And simultaneously, my oldest son was working on his ACT preparation. So I turned to him and told him to add in some credit score work as well. Want to put out there, again, a request for questions. Please tweet them, send them in through Facebook, send them in through YouTube. Really want to make sure that we're able to address any ideas, thoughts, concerns, questions that you all have out there. So, you know, Brock, what do you think? Have you seen anything internationally? One of the things you got to do when you were administrator of FEMA is deal with a lot of international countries and help them and work with them. I know that the U.S. is one of the leaders in emergency management and preparation and resilience, but can you point to anything you learned during that time or since that you think we could use as a best practice?
Well, first of all, we take for granted how awesome the emergency management profession is in this country. It is bar none the best across the globe. And yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of people that would disagree with me. The problem with our profession is that we've made it too complex. It's too risk adverse. There's too many rules and laws and everything that keep us from being efficient and effective and being able to respond quicker. But one of the biggest things that we need to start to realize is that we're really good at providing capability to other countries. But in 17 and 18, when resources are strapped, or COVID-19 or whatever event we may face in the future that straps our resources domestically, we haven't gone through an event where we've asked for resources from other countries to a large degree that I can recall. And you know, we got to make sure that there's no cybersecurity issues, customs and border patrol issues, or whatever else that may stand in the way of us calling upon help when we need it most on our worst day.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Brock. So here we go. I got a question here from Andrew Van Single. He says, emergency response requires swift action, which some would say is antithetical to the current preparedness and response framework? What can be done to streamline and be more swift, kind of in line with what you just spoke about?
Well, I believe that the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, and I understand why it was written the way it was written, because there were failures in response logistics, and but the problem is it turned FEMA into 911, and there was too much of an emphasis on FEMA better not fail in logistics ever again, which I agree with, but it solely focused on FEMA and not the capability at the local and state level, and then I don't think that we've truly incorporated the private sector into the response until the creation of Community Lifelines doctrine, which recognizes that they are the key to us getting back on our feet, not the federal government's response necessarily. Going forward, I think that through the Community Lifelines doctrine that FEMA has put out, and you need to go look at the Community Lifelines toolkit, what it's basically saying is that if there are infrastructure owners in your community, then you really need to rethink your planning and your response priorities in helping them get their stuff back up online. And one of the things with COVID that is interesting to me is that if you're asking FEMA to run logistics for PP&E for COVID-19, they're going to do it, but they're going to lock down the logistics system, period. And maybe they don't need to, because maybe the normal supply chains that support our hospitals through the private sector could be working just fine. But what's the balance? People want to punch FEMA in the mouth, whether it's Congress or whether it's the media or whether it's communities or, community leaders. They want to hit FEMA in the mouth and tell them, hey, we don't have PPE, get it here. So they lock down the whole system, when actually the private sector supply chains and the normal supply chains could be online, back up and running normal, and you don't need FEMA. But there's no real dialogue, in the past that we've had with the private sector to understand that. And we've got to get that good. We've got to become that good, Brian.
Very good. All right, Brock, we got time for about one more question. And it's from one of our next panel members, Mike Sprayberry, who says, Brock, what do you think about using the DRF as a supplement to fund lost wages?
Oh, man. Well, it's not ideal. I think, again, it makes FEMA's job, truly complex. Obviously, I was not part of the decision and the thinking as to why. Maybe the decision, the executive order forces Congress to act, to address the issues. But it's not ideal for FEMA. And here's the thing. The people at FEMA are golden-hearted people that truly, nobody ever calls them a hero. Everybody's being called a hero these days except the people at FEMA. And I know that some of those guys, have been deployed since 2017 nonstop. And when we continue to add to FEMA's plate, at the end of the day, I start asking the question, what does the nation want FEMA to be good at? Because right now, their mission is huge. They have been through it from 17 and 18, over 220 disasters when the 2 years I was in office, a new disaster every 3 days, to what's going on in COVID. Mother Nature's not going to stop. And everybody expects FEMA to give them the right answers and be good at what they're doing. And, unfortunately, we got to back off them and stop putting more on their plate and start asking as a nation, what is realistic for FEMA? Because we've never given FEMA a goal. Congress has never given FEMA a real goal. The American public hasn't given FEMA a goal that is actually achievable, that they can focus on. Their goal continues to get redirected after major events. It'll get redirected again after COVID. And they've got an impossible standard to stand up to. And there are plenty of people that disagree with me, Brian, on saying that. But until you've walked a mile in my shoes, you need to back off FEMA. You need to get behind them, but we need to rethink what it is specifically we need them to do. They're the largest insurance agency that's forced to run a broken program that hasn't been fixed. They are forced to put billions of dollars. They run 98% of Homeland Security's grants. They run national continuity programs and make sure that the executive branch of government can run regardless if we're facing war, pandemics, or whatever else. And they're always constantly responding to everything. The disaster threshold to declare disasters is way too low, and it needs to be reevaluated as well. We are approving disasters, really small disasters that should be handled at a much granular level.
Well, thank you, Brock, for that. And I will echo your sentiment. For any of our friends at FEMA who are watching this morning, we really do appreciate what you've been doing for the last 6 months and what you'll continue to be doing for the remainder of this year. We know the pace of operations has been phenomenal and extremely difficult on you and your families. So to our friends at FEMA and Administrator Gaynor, if you happen to be watching, thanks for everything we do. Really appreciate it. Brock, any closing words for the group before I move to the next panel?
It's good to see you, Brian. I have true respect for Jared and Mike coming up. They're two of the premier emergency managers in the country, and they're the bullfighters in the arena right now. So listen up to them, and hopefully they'll put forward what they need as state emergency managers. I'm just one aspect. I realize that what I say is not always maybe everybody agrees with, or maybe I'm not right. But listen to the bullfighters in the arena right now, Mike Sprayberry and Jared Moskowitz, because they're in the fight. And it's awesome that they can be with you today. Thank you again to the BPC. I really appreciate the opportunity of being here.
All right. Thank you, Brock. All right. With that, we're going to transition to the second part of our conversation this morning. And as Brock mentioned, we got two of the nation's greatest state emergency management directors, Jared Moskowitz from Florida Division of Emergency Management and Mike Sprayberry from North Carolina's Emergency Management Agency. We're going to spend a few minutes this morning talking about some of their experience over the last few months and what they anticipate is going to occur over the next few. Gentlemen, good to see both of you. I'm going to dive right into it. And Jared, I know that your connection has been a little bit spotty, so I'm going to start with you just on the off chance that we lose you. But how has Florida approached the planning effort for COVID-19 and hurricanes? How's it going, and how much do you have left to do?
Oh, well, it's good to be with you guys this morning. I appreciate the opportunity. So, so far it's going well because so far we've gotten somewhat lucky. As we all know, in this game of hurricanes, luck matters. But we've been planning for hurricane season really since March 1st with COVID-19 since day one. As Mike knows, I mean, we've been at a level 1 longer here in the state of Florida as he has been as well than any other time in Florida history, longer than any other hurricane. And so we have done more hurricane planning, more focus on hurricane planning at a level 1 really than ever before. And so, the thing that we focused on clearly is evacuations and shelters, rewriting the rule book on that. Obviously, we sent down 80 pages of guidance to our counties who obviously in charge of evacuations and sheltering here in the state of Florida. And so, obviously taking in the new FEMA guidance, CDC guidance, working with the Red Cross, looking at those specifically, and then how are people going to react? I think one of the things that we don't talk enough about, we do it with hurricanes, but we haven't done it with COVID, is this behavioral analysis as far as who will evacuate, who won't evacuate. I really do think on how people look at the pandemic, depending upon what side they are on what's happening out there, really will impact whether or not they go to a shelter, whether they evacuate, in response to a hurricane.
Thank you, Jared. And I've got several follow-ons, but I want to pose the same question to Mike first. Mike, how have you all been planning for this? Is it an ongoing affair? And where are you in that process?
Right, and I think Jared would agree with me that it's always an ongoing affair, planning. And but first, before I answer the question, just let me thank you publicly for your assistance to us back in Hurricane Florence as my personal graybeard advisor. And I want to thank Brock for his vision as the FEMA administrator. I believe that he was the one that got DRRA through and got it passed, and it's BRIC is a big deal for us. So back to sheltering, yes, the Emergency Support Function 6 led by the American Red Cross, we received a very detailed briefing on non-congregate sheltering. And so that is the direction that we are embracing here in North Carolina. COVID-19 has allowed us a bully pulpit pretty much every day with press conferences so that we can discuss sheltering with our public. And so each day we get up there and tell them that 2020 is a year unlike any other. And what you want to do is to look at your evacuation plan, look at your shelter plan. If you live in flood prone areas and areas that are prone to be hit by hurricanes, and look at, first of all, paying attention to your local officials whenever they give you an order to evacuate, making sure that you have, a readiness kit that includes a face covering, the different items that you might need to keep yourself clean during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then when you evacuate, go as short a distance as you can and try to go to a friend or family so that you're not in a location where you're spreading COVID-19 to others or could pick it up. And so what we've done is we worked with the Red Cross and Human Services and my business EOC to get a lot of hotels available with a lot of rooms. And we've stood up reception centers. And so people last week when we experienced Hurricane Isaias, people reported to those reception centers, and then we would direct them further to a hotel where we had a 72-hour block on the number of rooms. At the hotels, they would be greeted by American Red Cross liaisons who would brief them on what to expect in the hotel and take their dietary needs. And then American Red Cross would feed them by a stop and drop process where, they would be able to get their meals. And so it worked pretty well, but here's the trick. It wasn't massive evacuations. And so if we had tens of thousands, I don't know how well we would have done. Currently, we still are sheltering some folks based on the event last week, but that's kind of where we are. And I will say right here that we did look at what Jared's plan is in Florida, because that's what we all do. We share best practices, and they've done a lot of good work, and we're a pretty tight team.
Thanks, Mike. So, Jared, what about you? Were there any lessons that came out of Isaias that you're going to be able to tweak the plan with? Did you execute anything? Did it work as you hoped it would?
Sorry, I muted myself. So I think Mike hit it right on the head when he said, that this was more of a beta test than really, a real test of the system. I mean, I was a big fan of non-congregate sheltering, pushing for FEMA to make that a reimbursable expense for hurricanes. FEMA did a great job stepping forward, allowing 7 days of reimbursement before, 30 days thereafter. We consulted with Administrator Long and Administrator Fugate on our plan. I would say here's the one lesson that we learned, even though that the program wasn't used that significantly. And we got hotels in 3 counties along the coast for this non-congregate sheltering. I need to do it earlier. And so, a lot of time we're waiting for these FEMA declarations because we want to make sure that we're going to get reimbursed, which is extremely important, obviously. But if I could do it again, I would lock the hotels down slightly earlier so that I don't have to worry about competition from the power companies. And I'm losing a day or two negotiating with the general counsels of hotel companies. And so we have 500 hotels that have signed up that are interested in the program. We've negotiated a lot of pre-contracts. But obviously, as situations change, depending upon where a storm may hit, if you're doing host sheltering, obviously new negotiations may take place. So I think the big lesson learned for me, Brian, is I got to start earlier.
Sure. So, Jared, we've had this conversation before too. At the same time you're increasing supply, you also need to reduce demand. And you were doing that through an outreach program to help people better understand the risk they faced in their home. How is that going? What kind of feedback have you gotten on that? And have you seen any demonstrable outcome because of that program yet?
Yeah, so, for the longest time in Florida, we've done a Know Your Zone campaign, making sure people knew what evacuation zone they lived in. Obviously, if they lived along the coast, someplace that's surge prone. We wanted them to know that. This year, what we did is we added a know your home part to that know your home, know your zone theme. And the reason we did that, quite frankly, is let's not forget, for 2 months in this country, everyone was saying, stay home, stay home, stay home, stay home, stay home, don't leave, telework, don't go out. And now potentially, because of a hurricane, we got to switch that message, which is you need to leave, you need to leave, you need to leave. And so, in disaster communications, mixed messaging is very difficult. It's very difficult right now, in my opinion, to break through all of the noise that's going on, the differing viewpoints on what's happening. And you may only get somebody for a period of time that is listening. And let's be honest, as sometimes tracks of storms are not defined and things are changing, they're bouncing around, we can't pretend that people are always paying attention. And so, ultimately, we launched a campaign, a PSA campaign out there, reminding people to have 7 days of supplies. We changed that after Michael. 3 days of supplies was just not enough. I think what we're seeing is that if we, the state, provide people the comfort that there is a safe place to go, if we make them understand that we can mitigate the effects of COVID-19, but we can't mitigate the effects of a hurricane. If their structure is not safe, if their dwelling is not safe for the hurricane that's approaching, we need to be able to provide them an alternative to leave. We don't want people to stay if their structure is not safe. More people die from the water than the wind, and we focus so much, obviously, on the strength of the storm based on the wind capacity. And so I think we're seeing good results from that. I think a lot of the counties are using non-congregate shelters for folks that might be 65 and older, folks that might have an underlying condition, or truthfully just making them COVID-only facilities or people who fail temperature screenings. And so, we have 25 million masks, 20 million gloves, 11 million gowns on hand. We bought hurricane preparation kits, which will be a kit in a waterproof bag. Everyone will get gloves, masks, and hand sanitizer if they come to a shelter. Lots of social distancing going on. We got negative pressure machines that we purchased that we could give out to shelters if we had to. So we feel that we've given the counties the tools that they need to provide a safe structure. But let's be honest, we won't know how people are really going to react and whether they're going to stay or leave until the event happens. It's not been fully tested yet, but it's our job in this industry to make sure that we're communicating with them their options and make sure that they understand that if it is not safe to stay where they're at, they must leave.
Thanks, Jared. The next one is for both of you, and I'll pitch it to you first, Mike. But schools in both of your states are getting ready to open this month. Many of, especially in the South, our shelter plans revolve around the use of schools. I have 3 sons attending 3 different schools, and my wife is an administrator at a 4th. So I get to see lots of different plans and ideas and options. Are you getting any communications back from the schools about concerns of using them for shelters or other aspects of hurricane evacuation?
Right. And I will tell you, Brian, that here in North Carolina, we do not use schools that much for sheltering. We kind of went away from that several years ago and are using more places like large big box stores that are shut down, churches and places like that. And so, and to be quite frank with you, we are really focused on making non-congregate sheltering our focus for this year. And we don't want to have to open up any congregate shelters. And we're a little bit different than Florida. I think Florida has twice the population that we do, and obviously they have more coastline. But we know that we have to be prepared. So, schools, we have a lot of schools that actually are still not going to open. They're going to continue to be online, and then there's a number of them that are going to be a hybrid of online and in person. But like I said, we have moved away from using schools as shelters. I will say that I want to tag on to something Jared just talked about with Know Your Zone. We have Know Your Zone here in North Carolina too. Additionally, we have what we call the Flood Inundation Mapping and Alert Network, which helps us out particularly on our rivers that experience a lot of flooding due to hurricanes. And so a homeowner can log the home address into that system. We call it Fireman, and it will let you know whether or not you're in danger of being flooded. And you can also sign up to be alerted if you're in danger of being flooded. So that's kind of where we are. And we bought a lot of PPE. Most of our the CARES Act funding that we received, we spent over $300 million pushing PPE basically statewide. That includes shelters to be ready to accept evacuees. And so that's where we are.
Thanks, Mike. Jared, any issues with the schools there? And you know, is there a potential that this year could cause some longer term strategies in how Florida deals with shelters?
Well, Brian, you know better than anybody, obviously, that different counties are going to do it differently. So I think folks in the Panhandle, folks in some of the more rural counties, they'll continue to use the school model. Obviously, they've made tweaks to that to be in compliance with CDC, FEMA guidelines, the Red Cross, the guidelines that we sent out in our sheltering plan. A lot of the counties there are looking, rather than putting people in auditoriums or in the gymnasium or in the cafeteria, they're instead dividing people out by classroom to give that social distancing with only a certain amount of people per classroom. So that's been an innovative solution. Obviously, a lot of our structures are built with significant hurricane code in mind, hurricane windows of the like. So it's really going to differ by county. I do echo what Mike said, which is a lot of counties have looked at these big box stores that are no longer around, a Target, a Costco, to do that congregate sheltering as well. We'll have to have a mixture. Some areas, again, like in the Panhandle, rural areas, they'll only do, in my opinion, not congregate sheltering because the prevalence of COVID-19 is not that significant, and the availability of hotels is obviously not as available, let's say, in South Florida or in the Tampa, Jacksonville, Orlando area. So it really will be a mixed approach. I mean, where the division will help, obviously, is making sure that those counties have the resources and the tools to do it safely. So if we have to help with, cleaning the school thereafter, we'll help make sure that they have the ability to do that.
Thanks, Jared. So we started talking about counties there a little bit. Both of you have similar demographics in that you have large coastal counties with well-funded, well-staffed emergency management agencies, but you also have some extremely rural areas, and the emergency management team might be 1, 2, 3 people. How did they deal with the need to prepare for hurricane season during COVID? What kind of things did they ask you to help support, and were you able to help them with that process? Mike, I'll go to you first.
Yes, this is an ongoing challenge for us because I think that Jared would agree here. You hear about the Miamis and the Gainesville and Jacksonville and stuff, and like here in North Carolina, Raleigh, Durham, Fayetteville, Charlotte. But bottom line is there's many rural counties in our state, and they don't have the capacity that these large urban counties have. And so we are focused on working with them to ensure that they have good capacity, and just you have to do it in blue sky days as well. And we want to make sure that they have the necessary PPE on hand for everything from their court system to their migrant farmers to their schools to the hospitals that they may have, and so the law enforcement. So we've done that. Just as a daily occurrence, we have our field staff working with them. I think it's the same way in Florida as well. But I will say that during a disaster, we are well aware of the newer people or the people that don't have as much capacity, those types of counties. And what we will do is we will surge, some of our staff from the West, as well as our local incident management teams, to go out there and work with them. And they do everything from logistics to providing PPE to people to make sure that here's the thing, all of our response teams during Hurricane Isaias, we had to have them go through a staging point to pick up enough PPE that would last them throughout the whole event. And so, and then when they got to where they were going in the Outer Banks or other barrier islands, we wanted to make sure that those teams were set up and ready to give the full spectrum of response capacity. So, we work with all the different grants, and we're trying to change the way that we do business and make a lot of our program implementation more state-centric. In other words, like the hazard mitigation program, we want them to be able to select the projects that they want to have in their counties, but we would like the opportunity to manage the contractors, to hire the contractors and get them done, get those projects done for them, because oftentimes you just have a local emergency manager and maybe a planner, and we want to be able to take some of the load off of them. So those are just some of the things that we're doing here in North Carolina, Brian.
Excellent, Mike. How about you, Jared? Some of the smaller counties, particularly in the Panhandle, did they have the resources to do planning, and how did you help them with it if they didn't?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not even just the small rural counties. We have, fiscally constrained counties that may not even be that small, but are fiscally constrained for other reasons. I got counties that have 15,000 people in them, but 5,000 of the 15,000 are in prison in that county, where their EOC is 2 people and no larger than a small conference room. So look, we have helped the counties out tremendously. Everybody always talks about how disasters are locally executed and state managed, federally supported. Which is a great moniker, obviously, but the way I look at it, truthfully, is that if the locals fail, I fail, and then FEMA fails. And so it's my job as a director, as it is Mike's, to make sure that our locals have the resources. And so whether that was PPE in this instance, or whether that was helping them get those collection kits in those labs, which were difficult to come by at times, whether that was actually sending them personnel. We now have people positioned in every county during a hurricane, somebody in the EOC as a liaison, something we're doing, the last couple of years. And so to foster better communication, obviously we have these electronic systems. The counties put their requests in, but sometimes, those are nice, they're a little bureaucratic. We need it obviously for reimbursement. So communicating with that director more often, over communicate with the county, being honest with them, letting them express their issues in a safe way so that they feel that they're being heard, so that I can then obviously go and execute on the mission at hand and solve those problems. And so, it's really, like Mike said, all that blue sky work that you put in does bear fruit when you're in gray skies. And unfortunately, the folks here at the Division of Emergency Management here in Florida and all of our counties have more experience with this, than anybody else in the last 5 years, between Hermine, Matthew, Irma, Michael, and then almost Dorian. And so, we feel ready for hurricane season. Obviously, COVID-19 makes everything more challenging. Everything's a little slower. And I would be remiss to say, in addition to fiscally constrained counties and rural counties that don't have the financial resources, COVID-19 has had a tremendous impact on people's individual resources. And so I do think missions that we're used to running, like a food mission after a hurricane, is going to be a lot larger than it would other have been, because of the economic issues that COVID-19 has caused. We're going to be taking care of a lot more people in the recovery phase than I think we otherwise would have or would be in a regular hurricane season.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start integrating some of the questions from our audience here into my questions. The first, one thing is that our audience sees you all on TV standing next to your governor. That's what they picture you as. But what they don't see is you as a leader of your organization, as all of the state employees that help support your organization. You two have hundreds of people working directly for you. Those folks have been working hard for 6 months. If we have a large hurricane, EMAC is not probably going to be there to help back them up. How are you keeping your people fresh and how do you intend to make sure that you're able to meet the need and keep those folks energized when you do have a major event this year?
So I'll go first, Jared. And I just want to say, and I think Jared would agree, is that, and you too, Brian, we have to lead by example. And so, I mean, what I try to do is I stay motivated. I try to be the first one at the state EOC and the last one to leave. And I put out an email to all of the emergency managers in the state every day. And I have found that this helps keep people informed as to what's happening, what's relevant in the fight against COVID-19. Lately, I've been putting out information regarding, Hurricane Isaias and the associated tornadoes, and also the earthquake that we just experienced last weekend. And so, you try to, and I always put a quote in there, a motivational quote. I know it sounds kind of corny, but I want to let people know that they're not alone. Everybody's tracking, that we're sharing all this information. And I get a lot of the information from our CERT technical lead, Dr. Cohen, and I put all that stuff in the email as well as emergency management stuff, because right now we're working really hard to sync the effort of the state emergency response team. So you heard Jared talking about testing supplies, and we talk about PPE and our strategy, our pillars of strategy for isolation, quarantine, testing, and tracing, and then prevention with the PPE. And so we keep talking about it and pushing it and letting people know, and we provide the stats for everything, and that's every day. And so I feel like that's something that's good, and I've gotten a lot of positive feedback on that. I'll also tell you that I've got a really great boss, and basically my team has been receiving emergency pay. Not the senior level staff, but the lower staff has been getting a stipend during all this, because I think today is day 158 of the EOC activation. I don't know what it is in Florida, but I reckon it's been a pretty good while, Jared. And so, and I just think that you have to stay motivated and stay sharp and let people know that you care about them. I'm meeting with my teammates every week to get the briefings on the normal stuff. And the big challenge that I tell my people is we are not going to be complacent. And what I am challenging them to do is to come up with new initiatives during the COVID-19 and pandemic that don't really have that much to do with COVID-19. We want to grow the agency and be better. And I think that's necessary so that you don't become complacent. And we've been successful in initiating a lot of new programs, and that's what we want to do. Over to you, Jared.
Yeah, so I feel like Brian and Mike put that ball on the tee, so I can just kind of hit it out of the head of the park. So I'll start with salary, because I think it's a good thing that Mike touched on. I mean, I got to tell you, let's not pretend like that doesn't matter. It's a big deal to these folks who are dramatically underpaid to start with. A lot of states during the downturn of the 2009, 2010 time period, a lot of states obviously took a lot of incentives away from employees, whether that's not having salary increases or COLA, and a lot of that stuff never came back. And the truth is that I got employees that make $35,000-$40,000 a year, haven't seen their families, working 7 days a week. So that extra pay, that extraordinary pay, which we activated also here in Florida, is a big deal. I've tried to get creative, Brian. Obviously trying to get people off to make sure that they have time with their family. Let's not underestimate how important that is for people to be able to go home, spend time with their spouse, spend time with their kids, and recharge. We've done some maybe out of the box things, like letting people bring their dogs to the EOC. Trying to give them some comfort of home, since this is basically where they live now. But I got to tell you, looking forward, I think state legislatures, and I know a little bit of something about this, have to look themselves in the face because this idea that we can just pillage our state agencies and strip them down to the lowest common denominator and them not have the resources that they need. That might be a couple thought process, but then when it comes time to actually needing those agencies, like an emergency management or a Department of Health, when it comes time to a major event like this, those agencies being able to respond, how they respond will depend on how much investment you've had into those agencies, and part of that investment is into the people that work at those agencies. And so I'm hopeful that going forward we see state legislatures realize why those things are important. But look, we have plans obviously to bring in folks from outside of the division to help supplement. We're looking at bringing in a supplemental team. If there is a hurricane, and so we think that's important, because I think what we're going to do here in Florida is we're going to split between continuing the COVID mission and then doing a separate hurricane mission. And so, my core team will pivot to the hurricane. So people coming in and helping supplement keeping COVID going is extremely important, because we want people obviously to be rested and focused, especially depending upon, what level of event we're dealing with.
Thank you, Jared. All right, so we have just a few minutes left, and I'm going to combine. I got three questions that are kind of along the same lines from Barbara Spalding, Jason Pettis, and Patrick Campion, all of them regarding funding. So if you could, each of you spend about a minute perhaps, and I know it's way too short. What challenges are we going to face once hurricane season ends? We've got a lot of opportunity with BRIC. That requires match. We've got issues with EMPG cuts, SHISH gap, UIC cuts, etc. What do we need, conversations do we need to have with our state legislators as well as at the federal level in terms of what emergency management needs to start preparing for 2021? Mike, I'll start with you.
So, I'm pretty fortunate here in North Carolina where we've gotten a lot of support from our legislature over the years. And I would say that, for instance, last year they funded a pilot flood insurance program. And what we're doing is we are issuing these policies through NFIP free to families that are receiving funding through HUD and the CDBG-DR program, Community Development Block Grants for Disaster Recovery. And so we've gotten strong support, for some money that way. We receive, we are a state that provides the 25% match for the federal grants and public assistance and hazard mitigation. So we continue to receive those types of monies. We are able to match our EMPG and EMPGS. So I would have to say that, we're sitting pretty well financially right now. We are concerned with the continued cuts in the SHISH gap program. And as you know, Charlotte dropped off the UIC list. And so that was of great concern to us too, as Charlotte continues to grow. And but like I said, we think through careful management of the funding that we get, we can continue to become a more resilient state. And so that's what I would have to say.
Thank you, Mike. Jared, and then we got about a minute.
Sure. So I won't repeat what Mike said, because obviously I agree with everything he just said on it. I want to add one additional point, though, and it's really a problem here in Florida when you've had disaster after disaster after disaster. We've done a really good job getting money out over the last 16, 17 months, over $2.6 billion back to our cities and counties. But I got to be honest, these cities and counties no longer have the financial resources to lay the money out to do these responses and recovery. Sure, Dade County and Palm Beach County and Broward County do, but most of my counties do not. And so I'm really worried about the state having to step in more often to help counties and cities that are fiscally constrained do their cleanup and get their recovery off the ground, which again will put more constraint on the state, especially all the money that we've laid out for COVID. So I really do think that part of disaster funding doesn't get enough discussion. I think the feds just think that's on the locals. Well, but if the locals don't have any money, how do they expect us to do it?
I'd just like to add one thing there is the non-congregate sheltering program for COVID-19. We actually had to shift that to the state to be the grantee so that we could assist with cash flow at the local level, because just like you said, Jared, they didn't have the cash flow to be able to support it, and you know that it's needed. And so that's what we did, a state-centric model, I guess you would call it. And so just wanted to make that point.
I'd do the
Well,
same
thank
thing.
you, Mike. Thank you, Jared. Thank you for the generous gift of your time this morning. I know carving this much time out of your day is difficult, but I know our audience really benefited from and appreciated your insight. So thank you. Thank you both very much. Michelle, with that concludes our panel, and I'll toss it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brian and Mike and Jared. That was an incredibly informative conversation. I think we can all agree that Florida and North Carolina are in really good hands, and hopefully they and the Virgin Islands will not be tested as has been predicted with a robust hurricane season. Thank you all for joining us today. You can follow us on Twitter. We have a YouTube channel, which many of you are watching on, and Facebook. And we are planning another event for September 15th, looking at the 3-year anniversary of Hurricanes Irma and Maria. I hope you will join us for that. In the meantime, please stay safe, and thank you again for joining us today.